Welcome to the 25th Annual UCCS Economic Forum. I'm Tatiana Bailey, and I'd like to jump right in and get started. So first, a big thank you to Rebecca Wilder. This event would not happen without her. We make a great team, kind of like Brady and Gronkowski. You might think that I'm Tom Brady, but I'm not. It's actually Rebecca Wilder who is the QB extraordinaire. So I've changed up my presentation a little bit because of all the disruptions we've had over the last year and a half, almost 2 years. And I've really broken the entire presentation into issues that we're now dealing with. And really it's going to be addressing major challenges, some growing pains that we're seeing here locally, and then prospects for change. The first thing I'm going to talk about are labor shortages, on everybody's mind, no question. And in that presentation, I'll be talking about labor participation rates, lingering pandemic effects, demographics, income inequality, and cultural shifts, all of these in the context of maybe why we're having some of the labor shortages. And then lastly, the skills gap, appropriate training, and some higher education challenges. After that, I'm going to talk about inflation and how they're related to the supply disruptions, waning consumer and business confidence, and also addressing their small business viability and some of the unfair competition that we're seeing from some of the behemoth companies. Then I'm going to talk about housing, affordability, and a little bit on commercial real estate. And then lastly, transportation and some final parting thoughts. So first, where have all the workers gone? That's the big question, right? Well, the jobs number in September disappointed again, only 194,000 jobs gained. August really wasn't very good either, and economists for September had thought we would get somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million new jobs. And I think they were thinking that because the supplemental unemployment benefits ended in early September, but workers are not returning to the labor force as anticipated. At the September rate, it would take 2 years for us to get back to employment levels from February 2020. The unemployment rate, however, if you look, is 4.6%. Doesn't seem so bad, right? But remember, not everyone is counted in that. So for instance, if we count those marginally attached to the labor force, maybe people who are working part-time but would like full-time work or just haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, that's the U6 rate, and that's 8.1%. And then I'd like to highlight the red line there shows you that civilian participation rate and how it started really declining during and after the Great Recession, and we've never really fully recovered from there. So how bad is the labor problem? Well, pretty bad. The labor participation rate in February of 2020 was 63.3%, and as I mentioned, already kind of low. And now nationwide, we're at 61.6%. About 4 million people are receiving benefits, and that's almost double of what it was in February 2020. And we have almost 8 million people still unemployed, but not everyone is obviously receiving benefits anymore. We also have 5 million fewer workers due to the pandemic, and that is actually a subcomponent of that total 8 million. So we obviously had a few million who were unemployed prior. In addition, we have about 5.2 million people who are not participating in the labor force at all. 3 million of those are new, so to speak, due to the pandemic. And yet, a big question that economists are asking is, how is it that GDP continues to grow? And I think that's actually a really good question because, when you have this many fewer workers, how are you still producing things in the economy? Well, I think it's a peek into the future. What about robotics, automation, and other efficiencies? Are businesses learning how to do as much or even more with fewer workers? And that certainly has implications downstream. So who are the unemployed and the non-participating? Well, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that most of the people who are unemployed are actually ages 25 to 54. Those are your prime working ages. That's a big problem. Who are the non-participating? That's the bottom right. You can see that every age cohort has had people drop out of the labor force. Not a good thing either. And we have more women than men, even in Colorado, participating in the labor force. That's the table there. You can see that the prime childbearing ages are exactly the ages that have been hit the hardest in terms of a drop in labor participation. And I say even in Colorado because we are one of the most educated states in the nation, and usually more educated people participate more in the labor force, but not necessarily as we're seeing in Colorado. Now, how does this compare to other nations and what are the future prospects? Well, Peer nations have aging demographics like the US or worse, but look at the chart in the upper right-hand corner. The United States is the blue line, and our civilian participation rates for the prime working ages, 25 to 54, has been low for many, many years and fell, like other nations during the pandemic, but is still much lower than these peer nations. Most peer nations also have generous or even more generous unemployment benefits, so that's not necessarily the explanation. And then even before the pandemic, the labor force participation was forecasted to decline even more by 2030. And it's not all about aging if you look at the bottom right. Even ages 25 to 54, steady to even slightly declining labor participation rates in the US. And then this is also true for our region, which is not a good thing. If you look at our median age on the right, we're actually younger than both Colorado and the US, and yet every single age cohort here we're seeing declining labor participation. So we're not trending in the right direction. And to make matters worse, quits are at an all-time high. We had almost 4 million quits just in July. And this doesn't usually happen during recessions or early recoveries, as you can see in this chart. So now, why are all the workers gone? Well, the problem is so acute, I believe, because of a convergence of a lot of factors. Some of them are transitory. Okay, COVID worries, maybe not wanting to be vaccinated, quarantines at schools or preschools, keeping parents out of the labor force, supplemental government assistance. Yes, the 300 supplemental per week ended, but there's still some government assistance out there. And even for people who don't necessarily have government assistance right now, their savings rate may be higher if they saved some of the fiscal stimulus. People transitioning maybe from one industry to another, or maybe they've moved. That's frictional unemployment that should go away in time. And then we've had business deaths. I couldn't believe it. A couple weeks ago, the president of the National Restaurant Association said, we've lost 110,000 restaurants across the United States. Now, that's all bad news, but hopefully these should subside sometime during 2022. But what I worry about even more so are these structural factors on the right-hand side. We are down 127,000 childcare workers in the United States, and we were low and had poor retention rates to begin with in that sector. We've had a long-standing skills gap. I've been talking about that for a long time. Shift in family priorities and personal priorities across low-income and high-income and even younger workers. This kind of disruption makes people rethink priorities. A lot more early retirees, let's just say people in their 50s and 60s. Why? Because maybe their wealth portfolios are actually looking good, especially with what's happening in the stock market. The tight labor market means workers can be more choosy, and many people prefer hybrid or all even work from home. And then the tight labor market will not likely disappear due to demographics. And that, I think, is something that we don't pay enough attention to, and I'll talk about more in a minute. Now, how about some data to back this all up? Well, here we have the COVID cases per 100,000. Unfortunately, Delta, kind of threw a monkey wrench in all our plans here. But overall, as of last week, we've had about 44 million cases in the U.S., about 100,000 in El Paso County, and things do seem to be somewhat leveling off now. Deaths per million, we've had about 710,000 deaths, unfortunately, in the United States, and about 1,000 in El Paso County. You see varying numbers. This is sort of on the conservative side. I mean, luckily, Colorado deaths were not as high. We did have more restrictions. They were painful economically, but they did save lives. And then, of course, this tells us where we're going prospectively. The daily new cases have leveled off or even started to decline, and that bodes well for the future. I'd like to highlight the text box. The U.S. vaccination rate for ages 12 plus is about 66% and about 63% in El Paso County. So we're a little bit lower than the U.S. And the hardest thing about this, however, is that the vaccination rates for Delta have to be even higher because it's more transmissible. So that 60 to 70% is not really where not good enough to stamp out the disease. In El Paso County, most of the outbreaks have been at schools. You can see in the pie chart over there, the blue. The incidence in the bottom, you can see, has leveled off. It's difficult to say if winter will cause another wave. We just don't know yet. Now, the other thing I mentioned is that many people have a lot of savings. Not everyone, but you can see the savings on the left chart there, up, down, correlates almost directly with when those fiscal stimulus checks went out. Now we're at about 9%, which is a little bit higher than we were pre-COVID. But I think a thing to keep in mind in the bottom right, this is dated information, but the top 10% have somewhere between, let's say, 12% and 40% savings rates. But the bottom 90% hover around 0 to 2% savings rate. So that cushion is clearly not there for them quite as much. By the way, some of the savings has been used to pay down debt. So if you look at the delinquency rates for credit cards and consumer loans, they have come down. And that's a good thing. It bodes well for the longer term recovery, very different than the Great Recession. But remember, not everyone has access to credit. The typical person who has trouble financially can't get a credit card or a consumer loan. So we don't know where these people will show up in the data. Will we start to see more evictions and foreclosures? That's a big question mark. Now, the other thing I talked about is the skills gap, keeping workers on the sideline. We had plenty of job openings in July, almost 11 million, and as you can see in the chart, it's just off the chart almost, record high number of job openings. But many people are not participating in the labor force because they've given up looking for work, and this was true pre-pandemic. And a lot of surveys are saying that they don't have the requisite skill sets for today's jobs, and that's where the skills gap comes in. So there's a big argument to be made for reskilling or upskilling people. And by the way, there's roughly one job available for every worker. So the issue is not the number of jobs. A lot of times it's the type of jobs and the type of skills that are out there. And then I mentioned demographics, and I really don't think this one is talked about enough. We shouldn't ignore that we have a declining absolute number of people in the United States of working age. You can see in the chart there, ages 18 to 64. We had healthy double-digit increases in this population cohort, except recently. In 2019, it came way down. And the bad news is it's only going to get worse. In 2010, we had 74.2 million people ages 18 plus. In 2020, we had 73 million people ages 18 plus, a 1.4% decrease. Unfortunately, these declines started in 2007, and we can't snap our fingers and suddenly produce 20-year-olds, right? So your only guaranteed quick fix is legal immigration, quite honestly. And as a quick aside, Tatiana and Ian, my husband, we did our part. We had 5 kids, as you can see here. So, we really did what we were supposed to. I think they're all going to be productive members of society, although the jury's still out on a couple of them. All right, now Colorado is better poised than the US from a population growth rate. The green bars show that we have been roughly double the population growth rate in the state of Colorado for many years, and we're projected to be at about 8 million by 2050. So that bodes well for us. Most of our growth has been and will continue to be net migration, so people coming into the state. Now you'll notice, prior to 2020, we did start to see declines in there, and according to the state demographer's office, that was during the Trump administration because of some restrictions to immigration. So it's going to take a while to kind of come back from that. And then the other thing I'll mention is that Denver and El Paso counties are roughly about the same size now. And then you can see from this map here where sort of the hotspots are in the United States for in-migration. And thankfully, we are there. And it's interesting because, the middle, Midwest, and portions of the Northeast and South really are having out-migration. And honestly, we're just benefiting from that. And then El Paso County for projections, by 2030, you can see we have nice appreciation in those young cohorts, ages 0 to 49, 18 to 29, and then a little bit of a decline, 50 to 64. And then on the upper right-hand corner, you can see that most of the United States is flat or very modestly increasing in those younger cohorts, but older age is increasing quite a bit. So, our young population today and tomorrow gives us a large competitive advantage in the state and in our region if we train workers appropriately. Another thing to keep in mind is the diversity that we're going to have in the state of Colorado. This really means that accessibility to K-12 and post-secondary education is going to be of paramount importance, right? Because we have to make sure that since this is our future workforce, that they have access to really good education, both in K-12 and post-secondary. All right, what about incentives to work? Are there some cultural or cohort shifts happening here? Well, not a great surprise that your lower wage industries, that yellow line, they haven't regained all their jobs, right? And they're the ones who have been hit the hardest. And you know, when you think about this, it's really important to start thinking about income inequality. You know, something that is talked about a lot, even by the Federal Reserve. And I'm just going to mention that at the beginning of this year, there was an article that I published in the Gazette talking about this. So some highlights: the top 1% of U.S. earners account for about 21% of the country's total annual income, while the lowest 25% account for only 3.7% of total income. That's IRS data that does lag a little bit, 2017. The top 1% had an average annual income of $2 million, while the average income for the lowest 20% was $21,000. That's a 94-fold difference. Averages, of course, I do know, are skewed by outliers, such as the top 0.1%, which had an average income of almost $49 million. So I said, okay, let's look at the data a different way. So then I looked at wage inequality. Well, this is Social Security data, and this does not include some other things like dividends, such as the income metric does. So just looking at wages and salaries, it showed that the top 1% earned 16% of all wages, while the bottom 25% only earned about 3% of wages. But here's the kicker: bottom 50% earned only 15% of wages. And then the increases, you know, over the years since 1979, top 1% increased 157%, while wages for the bottom 90% grew only 22%. So we're not moving in the right direction. And then lastly, I said, well, what about wealth? Okay, this is where you look at bank accounts, cars, all assets, homes, minus the debts that are owed. And this is from the Federal Reserve. This data does not lag as much, and in Q3 of 2020, it showed that the top 1% had 31% of the total wealth. And let's just skip down to the bottom 50%, they only had 2% of the total wealth. Why? Because they actually typically don't have any assets, but do have debt. So the bottom 50% represents most of the laid-off workers from the pandemic, and their lack of wealth means that they don't have assets to cushion, right? Some of the wages lost or payments missed. And that's a lot of people, right? The whole bottom 50%. And their credit may be damaged during this crisis, which hampers their ability to build assets in the future. And this is where we start talking about generational poverty. And then here, you know, these are just the charts that I had in the article. You can barely see that bottom 50%. They're the red lines. And you can take your time looking at this later. All of these slides will be posted. And then, you know, the last thing I wrapped with in this article is, you know, how does this kind of measure up with incentives? Well, the federal poverty level was about 12,700 in this past year. And when somebody qualifies, they can get Medicaid, they can get other federal assistance, you know, so healthcare and so forth. And that federal poverty level for a family of four is 26,000. If someone works full-time at $7.25 for the minimum wage, they only make $15,000 a year, okay? But often those jobs don't offer health benefits, whereas being under the federal poverty level gives you access to health benefits. So that's where your incentives really start to get muddled. So the trade-off between full-time work, low pay, and receiving social assistance like Medicaid, you know, versus working, right, at a low wage. And also many females choose not to work because of the high cost of childcare, and hasn't that been a big issue lately? Higher education is increasingly out of reach, even for middle-income families who are finding it difficult to afford higher education for their kids. So the return on investment for higher education is not necessarily as clear as it used to be, and also the incentive structure in general is maybe not as clear as it used to be, say maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago in the United States. And as an economist, I worry about that. And by the way, the link for that article is at the bottom there. So what about labor and wages in Colorado and Colorado Springs? Well, the unemployment rates for El Paso County and the state of Colorado have been a little bit higher than the U.S. And then you can see the forecast that I have circled up there. But this is mostly because we have more people participating in the labor force, people who are saying they want work in the last 4 weeks. So that's a positive thing. We do still have an elevated number of unemployed. We have about 190,000 in the state of Colorado compared to 88,000 in February 2020. But like I mentioned, the labor force participation is almost back to pre-COVID. The bottom right shows you that the state has spent about $3.4 billion for their portion of unemployment benefits, but that doesn't include federal programs like for gig workers. And the little dotted line in the bottom right shows you where we were in terms of in terms of Colorado unemployment payments, and then look at how we kind of blew it out of the water. So you know, it definitely was a hit to the trust fund. Now, the good news is, as I said, we have more available workers in Colorado. You can see the labor force participation. You can see the states there that kind of stand out from a positive perspective. And then this is just a quick analysis that my office did looking at if we superimposed the labor participation rate of Colorado onto the United States, their unemployment rate would actually be 7%. So that kind of shows you why our unemployment rate is a little bit higher, and for good reason. Now, the other piece of good news is that this labor participation rate that's higher is also true in El Paso County. You can see, especially in the last few years, how it's taken off. And look at how nicely in the upper right there we recovered from the pandemic, having all these workers come back into the labor force. And then if you're interested here, you can compare regional unemployment rates. Really, unfortunately, Pueblo's still kind of standing out, most of them hovering around that 5.4%. But here's the really good news for Colorado Springs. Out of all the major MSAs in the state, we have regained really all of our jobs. We stand out. Now, this compares to Colorado, which has regained about 90% of the jobs in the bottom right, US about 81%. But hey, we're even beating Boulder and Denver at this point. So that's really good news for us in terms of sustainable growth moving forward. And this job recovery is amazing considering the large hospitality sector that we have, but also, you know, it's cushioned somewhat by the diversity of industries, you know, including professional and technical jobs where people can work from home. And that, by the way, is also pretty much true in El Paso County. Now, these super sectors in El Paso County, and this I show in my dashboard every month, you know, those sort of took a hit but continue to grow. And those in the bottom right, you can see construction, health, professional and technical, transportation and warehousing, finance and insurance, all growing well into the double digits. These super sectors accounted for almost 70% of new jobs in 2019. And these are probably going to continue because according to the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, these are some of the sectors that are projected to grow the most between 2020 and 2030. Now, what about poverty and wages? Well, the good news is that El Paso County has a lower percentage of people than the US in terms of the federal poverty level, only 8.5% versus 12%. But, you know, if we look at what the living wage is you know, what people need to make in El Paso County, according to the MIT Living Wage Calculator, let's just take an example here of a household with 2 adults and one working but 2 kids. That one working adult needs to make almost $70,000 a year, and a lot of that is because of childcare and housing costs. Even with 2 working adults and 2 children, each worker needs to make about $46,000. So, you know, that makes it challenging for a lot of households. The other thing that is not such good news is that we just can't seem to catch up with Colorado and the US in terms of the average wage for private industry jobs. And you know, there are a lot of reasons for this, and I talk about it in other presentations, but that's something that's going to need to be rectified, especially if our cost of living continues to increase. And then according to the Pikes Peak Workforce Center, we do still have a lot of work to do. In 2019, according to Tracy Marquez, the director, the Workforce Center was averaging about 125 to 150 walk-ins per day. And during the Great Recession, that was 375, but now we're only averaging about 40 to 50 walk-ins per day. Frustrating because we have training dollars that can be given to eligible people, but they're not being tapped by them. There are some new programs for upskilling and reskilling, but really, you know, this has proven difficult in terms of getting people in the door. Returning workers, Tracy says, are looking for more flexibility and work from home. People are cutting their household costs in order to maybe not have to work quite as much. They're starting businesses. They are still getting a child tax credit, some enhanced public assistance, including free medical through December. Schools are also giving out some funding food assistance and technology. But many parents are saying they also can't work because of the childcare issue. And another source, the U.S. Census Household Pulse Survey, said 31% of respondents were in homes where children were unable to attend daycare in the last 4 weeks. So huge problem. We do have some local initiatives like the Early Childhood Education Coalition, so that's helpful. And then Early Connections, Diane Price, I talked to her and she said, yeah, the child care thing is a huge challenge. It was before the pandemic and now it's just worse. Anecdotally hear of long wait lists, but the state tracks that data and it's not as robust as she'd like. Early Connections and a few others have raised their salaries up to $18 an hour even, but they're probably poaching from lower paying centers. So the pie is not necessarily getting bigger. Many statewide child care centers have enrollment freezes. Think about this, because they have licensing requirements tied to teacher-child ratios. So it's not like they can just snap their fingers and admit more kids. So this further reduces the available slots, especially for infants and toddlers. Now, there is a child development certificate through the U.S. It takes about 9 to 12 months to complete and can include some on-the-job training. Colorado has about 24,000 early childhood educators, and employees do make up about 80% of the budgets. However, 1/3 of Colorado preschool early childhood workers rely on some form of public assistance. Why? Because it's one of the lowest paid sectors. They made on average in 2020 $26,500. So that's just not gonna work indefinitely. And what about some innovative solutions? Well, DLN has a community-based training for early childhood educators. We're working locally to develop more apprenticeships. I thought one innovative solution, these place-based bachelor's degrees. An example of this is a program through UC Denver and 3 Denver child care centers. It's a bachelor's degree that is actually attained on the job primarily, so these low-paid workers don't have to leave in order to get a degree. Only 17% of Colorado child care workers have a bachelor's, but we know that those facilities that have these types of workers with bachelor's degree have better outcomes for the kids and higher retention. So if we got more of these workers to get bachelor's degree, couldn't we instead funnel that $17,000 back into wages? And finally, we're starting to get more federal attention to this issue. Colorado is hoping to put $275 million of federal funding towards reducing tuition and increasing pay. Now, I don't like deficit spending too much, especially when you think about the demographics and the shrinking number of working age people, but I don't think of this as a handout. I think of this as an investment because it helps get people back to work. So American Jobs Plan has about $137 billion for education and childcare. American Families Plan has a total of almost $100 billion. And you can look at all these different components. But again, I really think that this would be worthwhile because we're talking about getting people back into the labor force. Now, all of this induced me to recently dust off a study that Rebecca and I did a few years ago, funded by the Legacy Institute, looking at the short-term and long-term benefits of providing just a FORS program, early childhood education here in Colorado Springs. We figured out that the program would cost about $13.5 million, but the short-term benefits associated with it far outweighed that. So, for instance, about 10 to 15% of parents can afford to go back to work and decide to go back to work once they have subsidized childcare. Those individuals pay taxes, and those state and local taxes alone generated about $1.5 million. Then K-12 had state and local savings, fewer individualized learning plans and so forth, and that savings was about $2.2 million. And then a lot of these families get off of state and local welfare programs, and that savings was about $12.5 million. So if you do the math, 13.5 versus 16.2 in savings, the annual return on investment, is 19%. I mean, that's a pretty impressive return on investment. And if you include federal taxes, that ROI increases to 31%. And none of this even includes the additional gross metropolitan contribution, basically these new workers making products and services in the economy. And that actually came to almost $46 million. So the benefits are huge. And then what about these kids becoming productive members of society and doing just a little bit more in terms of being able to graduate high school and maybe have higher earnings? Well, that entire analysis came to a societal return of about 22%. And future contribution, because you're also going to have more more of these people participating in the labor force, an additional 2 million in terms of contribution to gross metropolitan product or economic growth. And then what about the skills gap as a barrier to work? Well, we had, as I said, about 1 job opening in the US per available worker. Colorado is 0.76 and Colorado Springs is 0.71. We have a very, very tight labor market. Here are the top 10 job openings, which I always show in the monthly dashboard. We had a total of 27,000 job openings in Colorado Springs in September. So that's clearly not the issue. The interesting thing is that the pandemic induced us to look at some more specific data. This was with Pikes Peak Workforce Center and Pikes Peak Community College. So we asked, okay, well, what are the highest demand certifications in Colorado Springs? And this was really good to look at because, yes, it's driver's license and security clearances, but it's also nurses and truck drivers and nursing assistants and so forth. A lot of these are short-term trainings that could be completed with livable wages. What about software skills? Well, yes, Office, Excel, and Word, but also Java, Python, SQL, C++, Scrum, and so forth. So again, these are all in the hundreds, and this is just for the month of August. These are really important data points for us to consider if we want to help get people back to work and into livable wages. So what about some common sense solutions? Well, like we said, let's audit some of these high demand job postings against the local available training programs. In the bottom, you can see something that I showed a couple of years ago, 2017, that my office did. Looking at nursing assistants, about 1,500 job openings that year and only 95 training slots locally. I mean, there's huge opportunity here. And then over to the right, Pikes Peak Community College does something really cool here. They're saying, okay, for some of these occupations, which ones do we offer a program in? That's just yes, right there. Now, it's not always easy to create or scale programs. Some of them are costly. But what if we focus on a few that are both high demand and scalable? And then also we're auditing here, Pikes Peak Community College, the high demand certifications against the training programs that they have. And again, most of these are shorter duration, affordable, and offer a livable wage. And then what if we incorporated in-depth education in K-12 about these high-demand jobs? And that's something that the community came together to develop this workforce asset map that we're trying to get into schools more and more, but it's also for employers and job seekers. And then what about also ramping up internships and apprenticeships in local K-12? And that's something that the Pikes Peak Business and Education Alliance is doing. All right, and then what if we also utilized community colleges, like I said, but what if we also subsidized statewide support services like childcare and so forth? There's questions now about free community college. What if we fully utilize public universities in particular, which tend to have a better return on investment because they're less expensive and they provide obviously the higher level training? And then what if we build upon efforts to transition retired military into some of these high demand jobs? I mean, look at in 2019, we had almost 84,000 veterans. Okay, and then the skills gap and higher university level education costs, especially in Colorado. Well, here I just briefly want to mention that, I show this often because Colorado, unfortunately, is one of the worst states in terms of the student paid portion of tuition at a public institution. That doesn't really help our students in terms of affordability. And unfortunately, we kind of stand out in the US in terms of being more expensive for public universities.
And another big barrier are student loans. I mean, student debt now amounts to about $1.6 trillion with 43 million borrowers in the United States. And that's more than credit card debt, about double that. And that amount has doubled since 2007. The average student loan debt is now almost $38,000 for all borrowers, but a huge chasm here. It's about $30,000 for white borrowers and almost $60,000 for black borrowers. Private schools are definitely a lot more expensive with the average loan of $55,000 almost. And then this is a lifelong commitment because 20 years after entering school, about half of student borrowers still owe $20,000. An average of 15% of student loans are now in default. And, a lot of people have student debt. 70% of college grads have student loans.
And then another big problem is completion. About 50% of university-level students who enroll do not graduate by the end of their 6th year. And this is a weighted average, to be fair, roughly the same percentage for all four-year institutions. The thing that's pulling it down is only a 25% graduation rate for private nonprofits. Higher education talks a lot about this. It's not generally well known that private for-profits tend to have much worse outcomes. So how much of all of this is attributable to costs? How much to academic readiness? How much to income inequality? It's probably all of the above, right? So what if we ramped up some of these training programs, including for four-year degrees? What if we put pressure on some of the largest endowment universities to build out satellite schools in marginalized communities, perhaps in partnership with community colleges and federal funding? More public service opportunities for university-level graduates, to give them loan forgiveness. This is, by the way, something that a lot of our peer nations do. Besides lowering their debt, it gives new graduates experience, right? For any government-subsidized program, I think we have to again remember that these future workers in higher, who have had access to higher ed, become taxpayers, often at higher brackets. So it's a government investment, not a handout. And these workers also increase our productivity and our growth rates, and it directly and positively impacts income and racial ethnic inequalities if we help these students. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears and talk about inflation. Well, consumer price index, as we know, has continued to increase. Interestingly, the cost of living index for Colorado Springs is now at almost 108%, and this is the latest data available in September. So we are creeping up there as well. Now, if we look at it over the last 12 months, we've had a 5.3% increase in prices from August 2020 to August 2021. The part that's concerning to me is that the largest increases are the largest components of the typical household budget. Gasoline, natural gas, shelter, which we know this metric lags, it's much higher than that, transportation and so forth. Now, August, the increase was, quote, only 0.3% month to month. But the August rate was probably lower due to Delta, because the thing that pulled it down were airfares, hotels, used cars and trucks, and so forth. And whether that sort of steadying will continue is difficult to say. The other thing is expected changes. Looking at the University of Michigan surveys, most people are saying they're expecting prices to continue to increase, and that's a problem. So, is inflation a long-term threat? I say yes. I've actually been saying that, pretty much for the duration of the pandemic, certainly over the last year. Why? Well, supply side, fewer goods produced during the lockdown. Preferences have shifted, more e-commerce in the types of goods. Supply chains have been disrupted early in the pandemic, and now supply chains are disrupted because of labor shortages. Fewer businesses, as I mentioned, and now a big one is potentially a global shortage of natural gas, and that affects many, many people's budgets. On the demand side, pent-up demand is a real thing. A lot of consumers have extra cash. I talked about that. And then higher income groups have benefited from the stock market rally, and they're continuing to spend in spades. And then, as I mentioned from the previous slide, if people expect higher prices, sometimes they pull up their purchases, and that exacerbates shortages. And then, of course, the big one that I've already talked about, qualified labor shortages, all the things I talked about above. Show me a business that doesn't need labor, and if labor is going up, prices are going up. Now, the Fed is between a rock and a hard place, right? Because they have two mandates, interest rates and unemployment rates, right? So if they're thinking about inflation and interest rates, if inflation is going up, that usually means that they should pull up interest rates. But we know that the labor market is still not doing very well. So what they're going to decide to do is kind of difficult to say. But so far, most forecasters are saying nothing's going to happen, certainly this year, and maybe no interest rate increases into next year. All right, now let's talk a little bit about consumer confidence, which has been waning nationally, although not so much in Colorado Springs. Well, University of Michigan here, you can see the pretty big decline. It looked like it was getting better, and then Delta hit, right? This is a bit of a problem because sentiment, when it declines this precipitously, sometimes can hint towards a double-dip recession. I don't know if I'm going there yet, but certainly keeping my eye on this. We have a much lower percentage of people saying that it is a good time to buy some of these larger ticket items like homes and vehicles. This is interesting. Vehicle sales, same thing, have completely tanked. That's not just consumer confidence. Some of that is a chip shortage and such. But we had a friend from Michigan visiting us this past week, and he's an executive at what used to be Chrysler. And he says many automakers are saying their profits are way up. And I was like, how? How can that be? Well, because they're selling high-end vehicles with large profit margins to the 1%ers. Made me think about what's going on in housing, actually. And these higher income groups, as I said, are confident in their spending because look at stock market returns. Can you say frothy? All right, and then you can see here kind of a similar picture with total retail and food services. But personal consumption expenditures overall have not dropped off. But it's not so much big ticket items that people are spending on right now instead of staples. Now, locally, we've actually done better. If you look at vehicle registrations, they've held pretty steady. Luxury vehicles are actually up, if you can believe that, by the double digits. And that tells me people are still buying and confident here. Same with sales and use tax. That continues to increase in Colorado Springs. So people are relatively confident here. Now, what about business confidence? Well, the National Federation of Independent Businesses does this monthly survey, and that hasn't actually looked so good, which is a little worrisome. I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but they did say in August 32% of businesses plan to create new jobs. That's a good thing. 41% say they have increased compensation. So can we say wage push inflation? 50% of owners could not fill job openings, and 91% of those said they had few or no qualified applicants. This is a lot of what's supporting my thoughts on the skills gap. Another survey from the U.S. Census, basically a quarter of all businesses are still saying that they're experiencing negative effects from the pandemic. But interestingly, 44% are saying they're experiencing supplier delays. Reduced supply equals price increases, right? Now, lastly, I just want to say, small business competitiveness is tough, right? Especially right now. We have these behemoth companies accounting for about 30% of all sales going to these suppliers online. And these behemoth companies have massive economies of scale, a huge benefit for them in terms of purchasing power for finished goods that they sell, equipment they purchase, labor efficiencies. Sometimes they can even obtain tax credits. So it's getting harder and harder for small businesses to compete, especially with escalating labor costs. And I worry about that.
So is antitrust part of the solution to these behemoth companies? Well, John Sherman back in 1890 addressed this, and this was the first act related to antitrust. And he said, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. Well, that was written a long time ago, pre-internet, and now we have issues with privacy, data security, unfair advertising. But luckily, this is an issue that has bipartisan support in Congress, which we all know is rare. So there is momentum for change. I'd also like to mention that in the last year and a half, El Paso County has really stepped in to help small business in particular with 3 COVID relief funds. Nonprofits and community organizations were also included in this. But overall, granting $26 million, assisting about 1,600 entities, and this is using CARES and ARPA funding. So that's actually very hopeful and promising. And then, ongoing efforts for buy local and even some cool ideas nationwide in terms of building like mini Amazon platforms, but for local companies to really help out small business with what I think is sometimes unfair advantages that the large companies have. So I have to say I pay attention to this because I think the viability of small business is at the heart of American innovation and opportunity. This is something we definitely have to keep our eye on and pay a lot of attention to.
Now, what about housing and housing affordability? Well, we know housing is a big player. It makes up about 12 to 15% of GDP. Expenditures on homes are usually the highest household expense, and homeownership is the primary mechanism for wealth accumulation. Okay, so in the U.S., you can see here how prices have increased. This is an annual chart, but in the right here, the average price is now about at $381,000. And price increases have really been in the double digits during this entire pandemic, and this is for existing homes. In terms of comparing to Colorado Springs in 2006, we were cheaper than the U.S., and now we're significantly more expensive. So why the surge in demand with these price increases? Well, interest rates are low, and those people who have money feel secure. Renters who are feeling secure are tipped over by these low interest rates and say, okay, boom, this is the time to buy. And then my little table shows that a 2% difference in the interest rate can mean the difference in a monthly payment between a $400,000 loan and a $500,000 loan. So although low interest rates are great, they do push up the average home price. We also have a national shortage of homes. Most people don't know that. And this is a remnant of the Great Recession. We're down about 6 million homes, and that takes a long time to build. Preferences are shifting, more work from home. That's something that doesn't seem to be going away. And again, those with money via like stock market gains are spending. And then here you can see in the table, a relatively small percentage of homes are at 750,000 plus, but look at how those have increased in the past year, the right bars there. So again, the people with money are pushing up the average home price. And then we have, unfortunately, fewer first-time home buyers and more sales to investors and cash sales, which isn't necessarily helping either. And then these price increases have really been across almost all cities, and that's true for single-family homes and for condos. In Q2 of this year, the median home prices increased about 23%. Condos have increased almost 18%. But according to the National Association of Realtors in the bottom right there, you can see they are saying that 2020 prices are going to moderate, and I would tend to agree with that even here locally. And then you can see for new homes, they really kind of went crazy at the beginning of the pandemic, and they've come down a little bit, and that's mostly due to supplier shortages and such, but also due to the increasing prices. Now, delinquency rates did go up a teeny bit after the pandemic hit, but now they've come back down. So hopefully they will not escalate in coming months. Now, Colorado is one of the most expensive states in the nation with a median price of about $500,000, and this is June data. And then apartments are also a lot more expensive across the state. We are ranked the ninth most expensive. On average, a person needs to make about $28 an hour to rent a two-bedroom apartment in Colorado. At the minimum wage to even rent a one-bedroom, it would take 72 hours a week. So, I worry about this from the perspective of all these young people who we need to continue to come into the state from workforce perspective, but maybe not being able to afford living here. And then local real estate, well, more recently in Colorado Springs, we had a 24% increase in our median home price from Q2 of this year to compared to last year. And we are now at the median price of about $360,000, and we are about 23% more expensive than the US. With only about half a month's supply and 12 days on market. So it's not scalding hot anymore, market, but it's still pretty hot. And then this is an annual chart, but then my little stars show you what a mathematical person will say is logarithmic increase. So the September average and median home price up there, you can see the average is almost at $500,000. So we are literally getting off the charts here. And then, the rule of thumb is that the average home price in most cities takes about 20 years to double, and that has happened here in the last 9 years, from 2011 to 2020. So the average home price increased by $101,000, even just between 2017 and 2020. This is clearly an affordability issue. And then here's just a comparison with some other MSAs in terms of the price appreciation over the past year, with Colorado Springs having that 24% increase. Look at Boulder, look at Austin and Boise. And then here, I talked about the distribution of home sales being more on the lower end in the US, but look at how it's higher in Colorado Springs. Most of our home sales are actually between 300 and 800,000 in August. And then this Housing Opportunity Index tells us the percentage of people who earn the median wage who can afford to buy the median priced home. So as recently as Q3 of 2019, it was 71%, not too bad, but now look at how it's 52%. Look at what's happened to Boise, another desirable place where a lot of young people are moving. Used to be 52%, almost 53% of people could afford the median priced home, and now it's down to 21%. And then home building, it's still increasing. My dotted line shows the healthy number of permits that we need in order to match population growth. We are reaching that, but take notice of the fact that most of that is multifamily, and that is definitely still getting a lot more expensive. Early in the pandemic, we had, shortages and exorbitant prices and things like lumber. But now, according to Doug Stimple from Classic Homes, now it has more to do with transport. Because if you want guaranteed date for delivery for a shipping of a container from overseas, that used to be about $2,500. Now it's up to $25,000. So prices are still through the roof for seemingly one reason or another. Thankfully, foreclosures are still low, although they are edging up slightly, but no red alerts yet. And then the apartment rental market, you can see here in Colorado Springs, that average rent was in Q2 was about $1,400 per month. The fair market value is about $1,200. This translates into about $23 per hour or $48,000 a year that somebody needs to earn. But the average renter wage is only about $17 an hour. So we're squeezing out these low-earning workers from the local rental market, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And honestly, I don't really see that changing because according to Housing and Urban Development, we are still considered a tight market. Why? Because our vacancy rates keep falling and our average monthly rent keeps increasing. So we're having good absorption and still a lot of people paying these higher prices. We are still cheaper than Denver, but as you can see, not by much. Brief comments on commercial real estate. Record low construction across the U.S. across all three major property types. The low supply has likely helped keep the market stable, right? Because if you're not building more, you're not sort of glutting the market. Some red flags for the office sector because there's low construction, but the rents are still declining slightly, vacancies are up, and negative absorption. And material and labor shortages, are really combining with structural factors like more work from home for the office market. And subleases are definitely up. Here, I'd just like to say that Moody's is forecasting continued increases in vacancy rates at about 20%. That's 1 in 5 offices being vacant. So we don't know yet, right? Will hybrid work result in less intensive use of space, or will we simply start to eliminate some office space? We just don't know the answer to that yet.
And these are the charts that show the office absorption, vacancy, and net growth rates.
Now, apartments, the greatest uncertainty is how the lifting of the eviction moratorium is going to impact vacancies. Remember, those moratoriums are still in place in big states like New York and California. The one thing I will say, though, is that this limited construction that is supposed to be good across the U.S. is not really happening here locally. I mean, there are cranes everywhere, right? And as I mentioned, our absorption and rents are up. So, I don't really see that we're going to have problems with multifamily anytime soon here, unless prices continue to increase. Retail, it's pretty stable. Why? Because this subsector has been adjusting for many, many years. Moody's is still predicting, however, a 3 to 5% decline in retail rents for this year. Industrial is a superstar. Why? Because we need a lot of warehousing and distribution space for all of this e-commerce. The national vacancy rate is about 10%, although much, much lower here locally. But these projected effective rents are projected to increase about 3% in 2021. So this subsector is actually doing very well. And then you can see here locally, yes, vacancy rates are edging up for 3 out of the 4 categories, but we're nowhere near that 20% vacancy rate, for instance, for office. And, according to All of Real Estate, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we didn't have enough product in the first place, and we didn't have a lot of spec space. So that's actually working in our favor. We are still, though, seeing an increase in vacancy rates, mostly because some of the large spaces like Comcast and Verizon call centers have decided that they're going to continue to let people work from home. And then if we compare ourselves to Denver, we are still a lot cheaper for commercial real estate as it relates to retail and office, but we're more expensive in industrial and medical office space, which is interesting. A few words on transportation, because that's always on everybody's mind. Mobility trends are showing less work commuting and less mass transit use. So that's kind of hard to tell, right? People might be driving to work less, but they also don't like using public transit. So what does that mean from a carbon emission standpoint? We just don't know yet. The pandemic does seem to have accelerated the move to electric vehicles and even autonomous vehicles. We are projected to have about 30% of all vehicles on the road by 2030 being electric vehicles. And even autonomous vehicles are now increasing, especially for transport. I will also mention that EV sales are up 43% in 2020 alone. In our region, the I-25 gap remains on budget and on schedule to be completed in November 2022. I'll believe it when I see it. Partially because of federal funding that's now available due to the pandemic and this $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which probably will pass. We're looking more carefully at this Front Range passenger rail going from Fort Collins all the way down to Pueblo. PPACG gives it a 50-50 chance. That's our Pikes Peak Area Council of Government. Various reasons why they think it may happen, connecting with the Southwest Chief and other routes. Against, well, there's a sales tax hike. There is support for it, but not so much by businesses, right? Because it'll impact them, so it's understandable. It is possible that the Front Range passenger rail could use existing tracks, so that 10 to 20-year timeline could shorten, all right? Now, a big question is, will there be as much support for public transit with the public health concerns of people getting into small spaces and as much need with more work from home? So that's a big question. And then lastly, what are the growth forecasts? This is better known as guessonomics at this point. Well, real GDP growth, as you can see, it has rebounded nicely after this very short recession that we had due to the pandemic. Most forecasters are saying that our growth is going to be about 5.9% for this year and somewhere around 3.8% for next year. Just today, I actually heard Goldman Sachs has revised it down. Most of the revisions have been downward because of Delta and some of the other things that I've talked about. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but the Conference Board is one that I look at carefully because they base everything on data. And then you can see here the reasons why they have brought down some of their previous forecasts. And then you can see here that also they're saying consumer spending is still going to be pretty good, as well as residential and non-residential investment. Their unemployment rate will probably be about 5.5% this year, they're saying, and about 3.8% in 2022. But they're also very carefully watching the labor participation rate. And then inflation still elevated this year and next, and then getting to that 2% target in 2023. And then what about locally? Well, the real GDP, GSP, which is gross state product, and then GMP, what our local growth rates will be, growth metropolitan product. And as you can see, the box that I circled here, I'm being pretty bullish. And so is the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, quite honestly. But these are my projections. And the reason is you can see the blue and the red lines, we have historically been outperforming the state for all the good reasons that I've talked about. And I think that will continue, especially based upon the jobs regained. So I'm overall bullish for Colorado and Colorado Springs. Coincidence, our presenting sponsor's logo is a bull there. But really, we continue to have population growth, mostly educated and young people moving here. And if we can keep things affordable, that will hopefully continue. We are a destination, and even more a destination for knowledge workers, and some of that is due to work from home. We are benefiting from the migration away from other parts of the United States. We have this diversity of sector, but also a lot of innovation in business startups. Local tourism sector is very robust with continued growth in professional and technical, including Department of Defense contracting, finance and insurance and healthcare. And the city of Colorado Springs is bucking a lot of the trends in terms of better labor force participation and continued growth downtown, which I'll show you in just a minute. And I do think a vibrant downtown is indicative of overall growth. So real quick here, these are some of the increases that we've seen in the number of establishments from 2006 onwards. So you can see, kind of backs up what I'm saying in terms of the sectors that are increasing. And then downtown visitations are up 7% from July of 2019. And these visitors are, people who don't necessarily work here, but just come for 15 minutes or more, according to Susan Edmondson. So that's a good thing. Unfortunately, the workforce numbers, we're still only at about 60% in terms of the people who are coming downtown to work. However, the silver lining is that we have all kinds of residential going up, apartments downtown. 600 new units since 2015, another 1,300 to be completed by the end of this year, another 1,000 breaking ground in 2022, and another 2,000 in the pipeline. And that hopefully will also help with some of the pressure that we have on rents, right, in terms of rental rates. So, all in all, it's a very positive picture. And then Susan also says that we've had net growth in the number of storefronts over the past year, more business births than deaths. And then, our tourism sector, that little box over to the right shows you, we have been outperforming Denver and Colorado in terms of hotel occupancy for many, many months. So our tourism sector and our enplanements, people using our airport, continues to be quite robust. So that is my presentation for today. Thanks for sticking with me. All of this will be made available just this one time a year. It's usually just for foreign partners, but it will be available on our website, as are all of my articles and media pieces. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now we're going to move on with the program.